Diane Stouty was extremely active in her church.
If church was open, they were going to be there.
And she was a hardworking nurse.
She's the breadwinner in the family.
Her husband, Mark, was a musician.
He just had a passion for music.
Between gigs, he stayed home with the kids.
We called him Mr. Mum.
For years, their unconventional arrangement appeared to work.
It was a home that was filled with love and joy.
But in 2012, their home full of love was ravaged by tragedy.
They said he died of a heart attack.
Her husband's sudden death was only the first in a series of heartbreaks that Diane suffered.
She finds her son dead on the floor.
And 9 months after that, her oldest daughter fell desperately ill, too.
It appeared that Sarah was not going to survive.
This is a medical mystery.
But coming so soon after 2 sudden deaths, was it merely a tragic coincidence?
People thought, this poor woman.
Or was this poor woman actually evil?
To believe that something like this could go on in our town, it was shocking.
Springfield, Missouri, June 10th, 2013. It was a spring afternoon in this city of 160,000 on the edge of the Ozarks.
It's a small city, but a great place to raise a family.
We're right in the heart of the Bible Belt here.
51-year-old Diane Stouty certainly had plenty of reasons to pray that afternoon. Her eldest daughter, 24-year-old Sarah Stouty, had fallen gravely ill over the weekend.
Sarah becomes extremely sick. She starts vomiting profusely. She can't keep anything down. And she declines so rapidly that they have to rush her to the emergency room at the hospital.
But once Diane and her middle daughter, 22-year-old Rachel, got Sarah to the ER, the doctors worked frantically to save the 24-year-old.
Doctors and nurses are rushing to try to figure out what's wrong with this 20-something woman who should be in the prime of her health.
They had put Sarah through numerous tests. All the tests were coming back negative, and it was unknown at that point.
Unknown, but dire.
Her body functions are shutting down.
She was not expected to live.
And the doctors had no idea what was causing it.
Why is she dying right in front of us?
Diane appeared every bit as mystified as the doctors.
She tells them she has no idea what has happened to her daughter.
Although that evening, even as her daughter's condition worsened to the point that the doctors put her in the ICU, Diane tried to put on a brave face.
She goes on Facebook and asks everyone to pray for her daughter.
Friends and family wouldn't hesitate to help in any way they could either. They knew that by the time her daughter fell mysteriously ill, Diane had already suffered more than her fair share of tragedy. Born in 1962, Diane Richter grew up in Springfield, the daughter of a devout Lutheran family.
She was very active in church here locally.
And she showed an early knack for music.
She did play keyboards and at least 1 or 2 other instruments.
But despite performing with the church choir, she was a shy, reserved teen.
She just had a very timid, mousy demeanor, did not really say a whole lot.
She never showed any kind of emotions.
In other words, she was a good fit for her conservative hometown.
People like to say it's a place to raise a family, not a fuss. That's what Springfield is.
The Springfield native did leave home briefly, though. Eager to help people, she attended nursing school at a small Lutheran college in Winfield, Kansas, which is also where she met Mark Stouty. 11 years older than Diane, Mark was a military brat who'd grown up all over the world.
My father was in the Air Force, so we moved a lot. When I was 5, Mark's about 4.5 years older. My dad was stationed to Wheelus Air Force Base in Tripoli, Libya. Had a house about 100 yards from the Mediterranean, which was rather cool.
But while his baby brother thought it was cool, the family's nomadic lifestyle was tough on Mark.
He did not adjust to moving as well as I did. He was just not that gregarious, tended to kind of stay into himself.
Although by the time the family returned to the States when he was a teen, Mark had found his voice via music.
He had gotten a guitar, had been learning to play it, and had a great voice, and had written these songs, and they were excellent. So I was thinking, hey, this guy's going to make it someday.
Mark got a degree in communications from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, but decided to pursue his music instead of a career.
He was so passionate about music, very passionate about life. That's Mark. Passionate about anything he does.
And over the next 8 or 9 years, Mark was the frontman for a series of bands.
He was a really excellent singer. He could wow the audience.
And he wowed Diane, too, when they first met in 1985.
They met at a bluegrass festival in Winfield, Kansas.
He was older, seemingly more polished. He knew more of life than Diane did.
And despite their age difference, they married that same year, just months after meeting.
I was the best man at the wedding. It was in Springfield. It was her family church.
The year after the wedding, Diane finished her nursing degree and gave birth to a son, Sean. But the new parents' joy soon gave way to anxiety.
Sean had seizures when he was very young.
And as the little boy grew, other issues surfaced.
He had autism, so that's probably a big concern for the family.
However, that was far from the family's only concern. Settling in suburban Kansas City, Mark found plenty of opportunities to play music, but never found a steady job.
Had the occasional part-time job, tending bar or singing in a band or something along those lines, but never steady income for Mark at all.
Which meant the family depended on Diane and her nursing degree.
She's the breadwinner in the family. She's the one who's really making all the money and works hard.
And the fact that she was the family's main source of income meant she was always on the lookout for a better offer.
Diane switched hospitals on a fairly regular basis for that slight increase in pay.
And even as Diane worked, the family continued to grow. Daughter Sarah was born in 1988 and her sister Rachel in 1990.
Mark was the house husband and look after the kids and play music at night.
Although with Mark only working occasionally, 3 kids was a lot to keep up with. So soon after Rachel was born, the family relocated to Diane's hometown of Springfield, Missouri.
Diane's parents lived in Springfield, so Diane got a job in Springfield, moved the family there.
Mark continued to concentrate on looking after the kids.
He was not really doing anything career-wise.
He did continue to play music, though, forming a new band soon after the family arrived in Springfield.
Well, he was the front man. We carried the music, he carried the entertainment.
Although by then, music was more of a hobby than a career aspiration.
He wasn't trying to make money out of music. He just had a passion for music.
He'd do free shows for any good causes, benefits, play for the schools, the kids. So he's quite involved in the community.
But mostly, he was involved with his kids.
We called him Mr. Mum.
Especially after the couple's youngest daughter was born in 2001.
They had 4 children, the oldest being Sean Stoddy. Then it was Sarah Stoddy, Rachel Stoddy, and then a younger daughter.
And by 2012, after years of working long hours as a nurse, Diane had taken a new job so she could spend more time with her family.
She was a claims handler for a healthcare company.
It also allowed her to become more involved with her church.
She was assistant music director.
Diane and Rachel both played instruments in the church band.
But she was still the family's primary means of support.
She's the one who's putting food on the table, keeping the lights on in the house, keeping the mortgage up. And her husband, every Friday or Saturday, would go out and maybe bring back $50 or $100 from a bar gig.
And while her 3 oldest children were in their 20s, they all still depended on her, too.
Sean with special needs. He worked at Springfield Workshop, which is a organization for children with disabilities that allow them to work.
Oldest daughter Sarah was in college, but she was struggling.
She wasn't the brightest student. She may have even had some learning disabilities.
She was worried about being able to get her degree.
It was a marked contrast to middle daughter Rachel, who had recently started attending Missouri State's Springfield campus.
Rachel was a very intelligent and artistic young woman.
She was the smartest one, the best student. Her future was boundless, was limitless.
And she was a source of considerable pride for both Diane and Mark.
Rachel was the apple of both of her parents' eyes.
They were a very happy family. That's the way that it looked to me, that it was a home that was filled with love and joy.
But as of Easter that year, their home would be filled with tragedy instead. Coming up, Diane finds her husband unresponsive.
He didn't look after his health as best as he could.
And her son falls gravely ill.
Sean had flu-like symptoms, nausea, he'd been throwing up.
On the afternoon of April 8, 2012, Easter Sunday, 50-year-old Diane Stouty called 911 in her hometown of Springfield, Missouri, with an urgent request for an ambulance.
Diane called the paramedics and said she'd found her husband unresponsive.
And when paramedics arrived on the scene minutes later, they found that 61-year-old Mark Stouty was more than just unresponsive.
They get there and they realize quickly there's nothing they can do. He's been dead for a few hours.
It appeared that he had died while Diane and the children were at church.
They just got home at 12, and she went and checked on him, and he was already dead.
But how had Mark died?
Springfield police talked to Diane Stouty, and she had said, well, he's not been in the best of health.
And according to Diane, he hadn't been feeling well for the last few days.
Mark had flu-like symptoms. He had not been eating. He had been feeling weak and kind of had gone downhill for those few days.
Some of his friends in the band and other people in the community noticed he seemed a little pale, complexion a little sallow.
His skin was kind of a yellowish color. So I told him, I said, man, I need to take you to the doctors.
Mark had ignored the advice.
Mark Stouty was one of those guys, like so many men are. I'm fine, and everything will be okay. I'm just feeling a little under the weather, a little indigestion.
Whatever his illness was, Diane said that on Sunday morning, Mark had refused to get out of bed.
She said that she asked Mark to go to Easter Sunday church.
According to Diane, when he declined, she decided to let her husband rest, a decision she regretted as soon as she got home from church and found him still in bed.
She goes, I shook him first. He didn't move. So I pulled the covers and I shook him again. The minute I touched him, I knew he was dead.
Mark's friends and family were grieved by news of his death, but they weren't necessarily surprised.
He was 60, overweight, bad nutrition, didn't work out.
He didn't look after his health as best as he could.
His lifestyle, smoking, things of that nature that might have contributed to his death.
That was the medical examiner's conclusion.
It was determined that Mark died of natural causes.
They said he died of a heart attack.
No autopsy was done.
Diane had Mark's body cremated.
There's a small private ceremony by Lake Springfield, and his ashes are scattered to the wind.
There was also a larger memorial service at the church, where Diane asked the surviving members of Mark's band to take the lead.
She approached the band and asked if we would perform one of Mark's favorite hymnal songs.
During the service, Diane put on a brave front.
My impression of Diane was that she was trying to be strong for the family.
And once it was over, Diane continued to do the best she could for the family, with a little help from Mark's insurance.
There's about $20,000 that goes to Diane after Mark dies.
It wasn't much, just enough for Diane to move the children out of the house where their father died.
It was in a newer area, and it was also a little bit bigger home than what they were used to.
Diane was making sure their family had a slightly better life after the tragic loss of her husband.
Mark's death hit the couple's youngest daughter hard. She was still in middle school when her father died.
It was very sad. It just was tragic.
21-year-old Rachel, despite the sudden loss of her father, continued to excel at Missouri State University.
Several of her teachers talked about what a wonderful writer she is, how she appreciated the intrinsics of math, how she was able to do art, not just painting or sketching, but 3D art, sculptures, and she did it effortlessly.
Older sister Sarah, who was also a student at Missouri State, continued to struggle though.
Sarah was nice, but not as driven. She wasn't hugely successful in honors and making the dean's roll.
But it was Diane's eldest, her son Sean, who seemed to have the hardest time dealing with his father's death.
Sean Stouty is on Facebook making statements like, well, now my dad's gone and nobody's ever going to remember him. I wonder what's going to happen to me.
The answer came on September 2nd, 5 months after Mark's death, when Diane made another desperate call to 911.
Police were dispatched to the Stouty residence. When they arrived, they find Sean deceased in his bedroom.
And according to Diane, the circumstances were eerily similar to his father's death 5 months earlier.
Sean had flu-like symptoms as well, nausea, he'd been throwing up.
And just like Mark, he'd apparently died while the rest of the family was in church that Sunday morning.
Diane said that she had checked on Sean before she left and he was okay.
When she comes back, she finds her son dead on the floor of his bedroom.
Was there some connection? At first glance, the young man's sudden death certainly appeared to be a mystery.
Here's a man in his mid-20s who should be in the prime of his life, even if he had had the flu.
But was that really the case?
Sean had medical issues, a history of autism.
He had a history of seizures.
It looked as if he might have had one recently, too.
He had blood around his mouth.
Was it evidence of a seizure? That's what the medical examiner believed.
The neuropathologist did find that based upon the findings at the autopsy as well as the history of medical issues, which included seizures, that his death was initially ruled a death by natural causes.
Less than 6 months after Mark's death, friends and family filed into Diane's church for another memorial service.
I liked Sean. He was a quiet kid and a nice kid.
The Stouty family would once again be scattering ashes.
Diane had Sean cremated as well.
And for a second time, Diane and her girls would struggle to move on as best they could after a terrible tragedy.
People thought, she's lost her husband, she's lost her son. This poor woman. It's a good thing that she has the love of her 3 daughters.
Diane also had the support of her church.
Her church family coalesced around her. They were her family to bring her through this time of grief. And it was a source of comfort.
Not just to Diane, either. After the death of her father and brother, middle daughter Rachel also sought solace in religion.
To Diane and Rachel, church seemed to be probably the biggest part of their life. If church was open, they were going to be there and they were going to be involved in it.
Eldest daughter Sarah, on the other hand, threw herself into her studies. And despite years of struggling academically, she finally managed to graduate in 2012.
She had a degree in French.
Sarah's long-hoped-for graduation was one bright spot after a year of tragedy.
She was very proud about going to college and getting her degree. That was something that she's wanted to do for a while.
But while she'd finally gotten her degree, Sarah's struggles were far from over, since there wasn't exactly a big demand for French translators in southwest Missouri.
Once Sarah graduates college, she's not really sure what she's going to do.
Although that wouldn't be the 24-year-old's biggest worry.
It's not too long after that Sarah starts to not feeling well.
And the symptoms were all too familiar. Coming up, had Sarah attempted suicide?
She's talked about in the past about cutting her wrist.
Or is her mysterious illness no coincidence?
To believe that something like this could go on in our town, it was shocking.
On June 9, 2013, 51-year-old Diane Stouty rushed her daughter Sarah to the hospital in Springfield, Missouri. The 24-year-old had fallen mysteriously and gravely ill.
She is in critical condition. She is this close to dying.
And despite all their best efforts, the doctors had no idea why.
They couldn't figure it out. The doctors didn't know what was going on.
This is a medical mystery.
And if the doctors didn't solve the puzzle in time,
it appeared that Sarah was not going to survive.
Her kidneys may fail. It appears to be that sort of systemic organ failure.
And as devastating as losing a daughter so young might be, it would be the third such tragedy that Diane had suffered in little more than a year.
There had been 2 recent deaths.
Diane's husband, Mark, had died first in April of 2012, the victim of what the medical examiner believed to be a heart attack.
Mark was a little bit overweight, and he was 60.
The death of Diane's son, Sean, who died 5 months after his father, had been just as easy to explain. The 26-year-old had a long history of seizures.
The autopsy determined that he had died of natural causes due to a prior medical situation.
But were the deaths just a terrible coincidence? On June 11th, while Sarah was in the ICU, someone called the police.
They were very alarmed by some things going on in the Stouty family.
The first member of the family dying, I'm sure that everyone was just heartbroken for them. When Sean died, a second member of the same family, I'm sure that there were probably some people wondering how in the world could so much tragedy happen to one family. And then when Sarah became sick, people had to start getting suspicious.
Although suspicion was all that the caller had.
The tip was just simply asking the police to look into the deaths as well as what is happening with Sarah.
Was there some connection? It was up to Springfield Police Detective Neil McAmis to figure it out.
The first thing I did was to go back and locate the reports in reference to Mark's passing along with Sean's.
And what the detective found was alarming.
There was a lot of similarities in such a short time period for these people to becoming so ill. And then with the 2 passings, that it definitely raised some red flags.
But if that was true, why hadn't anyone noticed 9 months earlier when Sean died?
Part of it may have been that the deaths occurred at 2 different homes. Unless you really knew the family or knew the last name or had been on both calls, there'd be no way to really link them together.
And if the similar symptoms and circumstances surrounding Mark and Sean's deaths were troubling, what the investigators heard when they went to the hospital was equally disturbing.
They find some suspicious nurses and some suspicious doctors who say, Diane Stouty is acting strange.
Diane's not really being too concerned.
Rather than her daughter's condition, Diane's biggest concern seemed to be her upcoming summer vacation.
Diane had spoken about going on vacation regardless of whether Sarah was better or not.
Was Diane simply putting on a brave face?
Some people say, well, she's a nurse, she's used to death, and you have to laugh to get through terrible things in life.
Or had she already written her daughter off as dead?
She seemed so incredibly cold and indifferent to what was happening.
Whatever the reason for Diane's nonchalance, the fact that she was a trained nurse did raise a chilling possibility.
Diane, being a nurse, she might have knowledge of something that could have been done to these people.
It was a suspicion Sarah's doctor shared.
The doctor suspected that it was a possible poisoning.
Could the wife and mother really have murdered her husband, son, and potentially her daughter? It was almost too much for the detectives.
That something like this could go on in our town, it was shocking.
Just hard to understand how a mother could do that.
And as hard as it was to believe, it might be even harder to prove. Mark and Sean had both been cremated, and finding traces of poison in Sarah's system would be difficult.
Sarah's body had been purged of pretty much everything and trying to get her back to life.
There was one possibility, however.
With Sean Stouty, they did do an autopsy, and they saved tissue samples.
So after consulting with Sarah's doctors about her symptoms, the investigators contacted the medical examiner's office and asked for a new analysis of the samples from Sean's autopsy.
The doctor thought it was some type of heavy metal or possibly arsenic poisoning, but he did not know.
And even as the investigators waited for the medical examiner's office to track down the samples for testing, they received some welcome news.
Sarah Stouty starts to get better.
She made a miraculous recovery.
But while she was no longer in danger of dying, she remained seriously ill.
I was able to speak with her a couple times, but due to the condition that she was in, it was difficult to get information from her.
So on June 20th, 10 days after she'd first rushed Sarah to the hospital, the investigators decided it was time to talk to Diane.
They asked her to come into the police headquarters to answer some questions. She agreed to do that. She drove herself to police headquarters.
I appreciate you being willing to come down and speak with us. It was very helpful on your part.
I'm trying to be.
Diane was very calm. She was extremely calm.
Even when it became clear that the investigators suspected some connection between Sarah's sudden illness and the deaths of her son and husband.
She said that she had tried to come up with all these different theories. She discussed, her nursing background and what could have happened.
So this is as much of a medical mystery to you as it is for the doctors and what you're saying.
Yeah. I have no clue.
Although she did hint that Sarah's illness might have been self-inflicted.
She's talked about in the past about cutting her wrist.
She opened suggesting that it may have been a suicide.
I've been kind of putting pressure on her to, you need to get out and get a job. Your college bills are coming due.
She has this mountain of student debt.
Debts that Diane didn't want to be stuck with.
After all, you get tired of doing everything for your kids, and it's like you need to step up and do it.
But if Sarah had attempted suicide, Diane said she didn't know how her daughter had done it.
As far as pills, I don't have much. Other, Tylenol, Motrin, that type of stuff. But
Anything else maybe besides pills or that she could do?
Well, if she got into like cleaners and stuff like that, but I don't know. I can't really picture her doing that.
However, there was one last possibility.
There's antifreeze.
It's a poison. It is not an immediate death, but it can be a death over a several-day period.
We had been arguing, and she got really mad at me. And I told her, for all the stuff that you've put me through, blah, 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 blah. And I think she went out in the garage.
But if Sarah had tried to commit suicide, why had her father and brother both died under such similar circumstances? According to Diane, it was because they'd all been drinking antifreeze.
How'd you know they were drinking antifreeze, Diane?
They told me.
Had Diane's husband, son, and daughter all committed suicide? The investigators were skeptical.
You and I both know why you knew they were drinking antifreeze.
And it didn't have a thing to do with suicide.
You knew, Diane, that they were drinking antifreeze because you were giving it to them.
And I didn't know what else to do.
Diane did confess. It was a several-hour-long interview, but she did end up confessing.
She confessed to the murder of her husband.
Who's the first person that you killed?
Mark.
Heard more than enough. They placed Diane under arrest.
If you can stand up for us, we're going to have to put some handcuffs on you. We're not going to put them on tight, but I've had you put your hands on your head.
Formalities.
Yeah, it is.
The investigators had a confession. But had it come too easily? Was it possible there was someone Diane was trying to protect? Coming up, the investigators uncover a new twist.
Do you recognize this?
The journal was written several months before Mark and Sean were killed.
But where will it point them?
This just wasn't Mom involved.
By the morning of June 21st, 2013, it had been several hours since Diane Stouty had confessed to poisoning 3 members of her family.
You expected the antifreeze to, after they drank it, that it would be quick and it would kill them right away.
I really don't know why she decided to confess. Maybe she was worried about what everybody else was going to think. She was so heavily involved in church.
Whatever Diane's reason for confessing, that morning the Springfield, Missouri authorities charged the 51-year-old mother of 4 with 2 counts of murder. One was for the April 2012 death of her husband, Mark. The other for poisoning her son, Sean, 5 months later.
It was just so bizarre for a woman to kill her own family in such an awful way.
She was also charged with the attempted murder of her daughter, Sarah Stouty. The 24-year-old managed to survive the attempt on her life, but remained seriously ill.
Sarah Stouty's in the hospital for a long time.
News of Diane's arrest took family and friends by surprise.
I was shocked. I was shocked because she was the widow. I mean, she was the victim. She played it.
I thought, how could this be? This is the picture-perfect family. Everything, there was no indications of any darkness or sinister activities.
However, no one appeared more shocked than Sarah's younger sister, 22-year-old Rachel Stouty. With her older sister still incapacitated and her younger sister still a minor, the investigators figured that Rachel was their chance for a witness who could give them insight into the family situation.
Rachel was the crown jewel of the family. She was the smartest one.
But when the investigators brought Rachel in for a statement shortly after her mother's arrest, Diane's middle daughter completely broke down.
God. It's a lot to process. I don't even know how you actually process that, to be honest with you, Rachel.
Oh, God.
Rachel's statement was a bust, but the search of the family's home that same day did produce a surprising piece of evidence, one that would send the investigation in a new and entirely unexpected direction. What the investigators found was a handwritten journal, and one entry immediately caught their eye.
The journal was written in June of 2011, several months before Mark and Sean were killed.
And as the investigators explained to Diane when they brought her in for another round of questioning, the contents of that journal entry were explosive.
It's sad when I realize how my father will pass on in the next 2 months, and how Sean, my brother, will move on shortly after.
One of Diane's daughters knew that she planned to poison Mark and Sean. But which one?
We both know this is Rachel's writing.
This just wasn't Mom involved.
Did she put any antifreeze into their drinks as well?
No,
It was only you.
just me.
But was that true? Or was Diane merely covering for her daughter?
Diane was never going to roll on her daughter. She was never going to give Rachel up.
The investigators weren't about to give up either. In fact, even as they talked to Diane, the investigators brought Rachel in for questioning too. Although, rather than confront her directly, they started out treating her as a witness.
Did you ever have any suspicions about anything when your dad and brother and sister got sick?
In hindsight now, yeah. I mean, now that I think on it, yes, but God. It's hard to even imagine something like that.
It was a good act. It might even have fooled the investigators if it weren't for one thing.
Do you recognize this?
And I did confront her with the evidence of the journal.
What is that?
Little journal thing.
A journal thing? Whose journal?
Mine.
Your journal?
Rachel owned up to writing the journal entries, but that wasn't all that she admitted.
I talked to Mom about it, and she mentioned she was thinking of hurting him.
And she'd asked for Rachel's help.
Apparently, Diane Stouty and Rachel Stouty did a lot of research on the best ways to kill people.
Mainly she was looking for poison.
Rachel was doing a lot of this research at Missouri State University on her school computer.
Basically went through different options. Was trying to find things that wouldn't be traceable, or at least would be hard to trace.
And eventually, they'd settled on antifreeze.
Why was antifreeze decided?
Because in general, you could put it in something and you couldn't taste it.
Antifreeze is largely odorless, tasteless. If you can put it in soda, it'll do the trick.
In addition to detailing how they'd administered the poison, Rachel also explained her mother's motive for the murders, starting with the death of her father.
Dad was basically a drain on her.
I could see Diane being very resentful of having to support the family.
Rachel said that Diane resented her son, Sean, too.
She would just go on and on about him just being a burden, basically.
And according to her daughter, Diane also had little patience for her son's autism.
And she described him as being worse than a pest.
I mean, he did have some annoying quirks.
And once Diane had gotten rid of Sean, Sarah was next on her list.
She wasn't going anywhere with her life, and that, can't remember any other specific things, but just a general frustration and something needs to be done.
She had these student loans, and the student loans needed to be paid, but she hadn't gotten a job.
She was very adamant on that Sarah was just a burden, that Sarah needed to be taken care of.
And by taken care of, I mean...
She means...
killed.
Yeah.
And every step of the way, Rachel had willingly gone along with her mother's plan.
Rachel Stouty was always her mom's favorite. And without the obstacles of a brother or an older sister or a dad who's in the way, all of those stressors are gone.
Whatever Rachel's motivation, her confession was more than enough for the authorities to place her under arrest.
We did file felony charges against Rachel that mirrored what was filed against Diane: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of first-degree assault, and 1 count of armed criminal action.
Though her confession didn't make Diane's deadly plot any easier to comprehend.
But it was just hard to understand how a mother could do that, but then to also recruit her daughter, and how either of them could be involved in something so terrible. It was evil.
Coming up, will Rachel turn on her mother at trial?
She almost had to have been driven at some level by Diane.
And if so, what will her betrayal cost Diane?
The prosecutor demanded the death penalty.
On January 21, 2016, Diane Stouty was in a Springfield, Missouri courtroom. It had been 2.5 years since the 53-year-old mother of 4 was arrested for the murders of her husband Mark and her son Sean, as well as the attempt on her daughter Sarah's life. According to Diane's confession, she'd poisoned all 3 with antifreeze.
Because of Sean's autopsy, there were tissue samples that were saved, and they were able to go back later on and discover the antifreeze crystals on his brain.
It caused a lot of questions within the community of how could anyone do this? How does something like this happen here in Springfield?
Even more difficult for the community to comprehend, Diane's daughter Rachel had also been charged with the murders and the attempted murder of her sister.
Rachel, I cannot envision being evil. I thought she almost had to have been driven at some level by Diane.
And based on how they handled the case against the 25-year-old, the prosecutors clearly considered her mother the mastermind, too.
They gave Rachel Stouty a deal, and she eagerly took it.
She did agree to testify on behalf of the state.
Testimony that could have cost her mother dearly.
The prosecutor demanded the death penalty for Diane Stouty.
But as it turned out, Rachel would never take the stand against her mother. Diane wasn't in court to stand trial.
She takes a deal as well. The prosecutor takes the death penalty off the table, and Diane Stouty agrees that she's a murderer.
In exchange for her plea, Diane received a life sentence.
She is not eligible for probation or parole.
She will die in prison.
Diane showed no emotion when the sentence was handed down.
She does not say anything. She sits there.
And her silence only made the horrible crime she committed that much harder to understand.
Diane appeared normal, and then find out that there was evil lurking in the shadows.
The harder she works and the more money she makes, the more she sees it just going out the door, to student loan debts, to feeding the 5 other mouths in her family. And she just can't get ahead. It's almost sad, right up until you get to the antifreeze part.
Ocean City, Maryland, was busy that Memorial Day weekend in 2002. It was the kind of holiday weekend when people arrived looking for a few days away from ordinary life. A place where strangers could cross paths for only a few hours and then disappear back into the crowd. For Joshua Edward Ford and Martha Jenny Crutchley, the trip was supposed to be exactly that. A holiday together in Ocean City, a temporary escape before returning to the routines waiting for them at home. Instead, the weekend became the final chapter of both their lives. What makes the case difficult to comprehend is how ordinary the beginning appeared. There was no long history connecting the people involved. There was no established relationship between the two couples. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley did not arrive in Ocean City knowing Erica Elaine Sifford and Benjamin Adam B.J. Sifford. They were strangers. And yet, within a matter of hours, the paths of these 4 people would become permanently connected by a double murder investigation. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley had traveled from Virginia to Ocean City for the Memorial Day weekend. At the same time, Erica and Benjamin Sifford were also in Ocean City. On the evening of Saturday, May 25th, the two couples met on a bus traveling toward Secrets, a well-known entertainment destination in Ocean City. The meeting itself appeared unremarkable. The 4 people had simply crossed paths while traveling to the same place. According to the information presented in the Maryland court record, Ford and Crutchley helped pay the Siffords' bus fare because the couple did not have the necessary change. In return, there was an understanding that the Siffords would buy them drinks once they arrived. It was a small interaction, the sort of exchange that might normally disappear from memory as soon as the night was over. But in this case, it became one of the last known moments in which Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley were alive and together with people who would later be convicted in connection with their deaths. The two couples continued towards Secrets. At this stage of the story, there was no clear indication in the available evidence that the evening was heading toward violence. There were simply 4 people who had met during a holiday weekend. That ordinary beginning is important because the horror of the case does not come from some obvious confrontation that everyone could see coming. It comes from the distance between what the night appeared to be and what investigators would eventually determine had happened, somewhere between the beginning of that evening and the early morning hours of May 26th. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley disappeared. They would never return home. One of the strangest details in the timeline came only hours later. At approximately 3 o'clock in the morning on May 26th, Erica Sifford made a 911 call. She reported that people she did not know were inside her apartment. She also said that she could not find her wallet and was afraid she might be dealing with a break-in. The call ended quickly, and no police officers were dispatched to the apartment at that time. In isolation, the call could have been interpreted as a report from someone who believed she was in danger. But later, after Ford and Crutchley had been reported missing and investigators began reconstructing the events of the weekend, the call acquired a very different significance. The apartment Erica had described as the place where unknown people were allegedly present would eventually become one of the central locations in the investigation. Investigators would later find evidence there connecting the missing couple to the Sifrits, including photographs, blood, DNA evidence, and other physical evidence. But on the morning of May 26th, none of that was yet known. For Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley, the night had simply ended without them returning to their accommodation. Their disappearance did not immediately produce the full-scale investigation that would follow. It was only after the holiday weekend that the absence of one of them became impossible to ignore. On May 28th, a co-worker of Martha Crutchley noticed that she had not returned to work after the Memorial Day weekend. Concern grew, and Fairfax City Police were notified. They contacted authorities in Ocean City. When investigators examined the couple's situation, they found something that made a voluntary disappearance increasingly difficult to explain. Their vehicle was still there, and their personal belongings remained at their accommodation. There was no clear indication in the supplied evidence that Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley had intentionally left Ocean City. Their belongings had not been gathered and taken with them. There was no known call explaining where they had gone. There was no obvious reason for the couple to simply vanish. The investigation, therefore, began to focus on a much more troubling possibility. Something had happened to them. At that point, investigators still did not have the complete story. They knew two people were missing. They knew they had been in Ocean City. They knew that their belongings remained behind. And they knew that the last days of their holiday needed to be reconstructed carefully. The encounter with the Sifrits would eventually become central to that reconstruction. But the decisive breakthrough did not initially come from a murder scene or from the discovery of a body. It came from an entirely different incident. On the night of May 31st, only days after Ford and Crutchley disappeared, Ocean City Police responded to an alarm at a closed Hooters merchandise store. When officers arrived, they encountered Erica and Benjamin Sifrit. The two were taking merchandise from the store and placing it into their Jeep Cherokee. At first, the case appeared to be a burglary and theft investigation. But the officers' discovery of weapons and other items would soon transform the meaning of the encounter. Benjamin was carrying a 9mm handgun and a knife. Erica had a .357 Magnum concealed behind her back in her jeans, along with another knife. Inside the Jeep, police found a .45 caliber firearm, ski masks, plastic restraints, duct tape, and other items associated with restraint or concealment. Then investigators examined Erica's purse. She said she needed her Xanax and Paxil, and an officer searched the purse for the medication. What they found instead was far more significant. Inside were 4 spent .357 Magnum shell casings and 1 live round. More importantly, in another small wallet inside Erica's belongings, investigators found identification belonging to Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. The two people whose disappearance had become the subject of an investigation were now connected directly to the woman standing in front of police during an unrelated burglary investigation. That discovery changed the direction of the case. The Hooters break-in was no longer simply a burglary. The missing person investigation now had a tangible connection to Erica Sifrit and Benjamin Sifrit. The question was no longer only where Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley had gone. Investigators now had to ask why identification belonging to both missing people was in Erica Sifrit's possession, why she was carrying a .357 Magnum, and what connection the couple had to the Sifrits' apartment. The answers would lead investigators back to the beginning of the holiday weekend, back to the chance meeting on the bus, and ultimately into an apartment where the physical evidence would begin to tell a story that neither disappearance alone could explain. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley had arrived in Ocean City for a holiday. They had met two strangers on a bus. They had gone out together. Then they vanished. By the end of May 31st, the investigation had finally found its first unmistakable thread. It was inside Erica Sifrit's purse, among bullets and identification cards, and it pointed directly toward two missing people who had not been seen alive since the night they met the Sifrits. By the time Joshua Edward Ford and Martha Jenny Crutchley arrived in Ocean City for the Memorial Day weekend, there was nothing unusual about the trip. They had come from Virginia looking for a holiday away from home. Ocean City was crowded, the weekend was underway, and the evening offered the kind of temporary escape that brought thousands of people to the Maryland coast. Somewhere among that crowd were Erica Elaine Sifrit and Benjamin Adam B.J. Sifrit. The two couples did not know one another before that night. Their first contact came on a bus traveling towards Secrets. Ford and Crutchley helped pay the Sifrits' fare because they did not have enough change, with an understanding that the Sifrits would buy them drinks after they arrived. It was an ordinary interaction between strangers. The four eventually continued to Secrets, where they spent part of the evening. At that point, there was no clear indication that the meeting would become important to investigators. There was no obvious reason for anyone watching them to believe that two of the four people would soon disappear. Yet sometime after that evening began, the relationship between the two couples changed dramatically. According to the prosecution's theory presented later in court, after leaving Secrets, Ford and Crutchley went with Erica and Benjamin back to the Sifrit apartment. What happened inside that apartment became one of the central questions of the entire case. The prosecution argued that the confrontation began with a missing wallet. Erica claimed that her wallet had disappeared and that Ford and Crutchley were responsible for finding it. On the surface, the issue was a small personal possession. But according to the prosecution, the dispute escalated into something far more serious. Ford and Crutchley were forced into the bathroom area of the apartment. Firearms were used. Joshua Ford was shot. Martha Crutchley was also killed. From there, according to the prosecution, the events moved from violence to concealment. The bodies were eventually divided and removed from the apartment. It is important, however, to separate what the prosecution argued from what can be established with certainty about every moment of the killings. The physical evidence provided important connections between the victims, the apartment, and the weapons, but because both victims were dead and their remains were incomplete, not every detail of the confrontation could be reconstructed with certainty. That distinction would later become particularly important during the trials, because Benjamin Sifrit gave a different account of what happened inside the apartment. But before that account was heard in court, there was another strange event that investigators would have to examine: a 911 call made by Erica Sifrit in the early morning hours of May 26th. At approximately 3 in the morning, Erica contacted emergency services. She said that people she did not know were inside her apartment. She also said that she could not find her wallet and was afraid she might be dealing with an intrusion. The call ended quickly. No officers were sent to the apartment at that time. In retrospect, the call became significant because the apartment Erica described as being occupied by unknown people would later be identified as the location where investigators found substantial evidence connected to Ford and Crutchley. But at the moment the call was made, authorities did not have the information that would later transform its meaning. There was no completed murder investigation yet. There were no recovered remains. There was no known connection between the Sifrits and two missing visitors from Virginia. There was only a short emergency call in which Erica reported a problem involving her wallet and people she claimed she did not know. The significance of that call emerged only after the disappearance was reported. The next several days created a gap in the story that investigators would eventually try to fill. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley did not return home. Their absence initially existed within the confusion of a holiday weekend. Ocean City was full of visitors, and people could move around without immediately attracting attention. But by May 28th, the situation had become serious. A co-worker of Martha Crutchley noticed that she had not returned to work following the Memorial Day holiday. Concern led to a report to Fairfax City Police. Those authorities contacted Ocean City Police, and investigators began looking into the couple's whereabouts. What they found was troubling. Ford and Crutchley's vehicle was still at their accommodation. Their personal belongings were still there as well. The physical presence of their possessions suggested that the couple had not simply packed up and left. Their disappearance was therefore not just an unexplained absence. There was now a strong reason to believe that something had happened between the last time they were known to be with others and the moment they were discovered missing. Investigators needed to establish who had last seen them, where they had gone, and whether anyone had a reason to harm them. The meeting with the Siffrits would become increasingly important as the investigation progressed. But the most significant evidence had not yet been found. The breakthrough came on May 31st, when police responded to an alarm at a closed Hooters merchandise store. Erica and Benjamin Siffrit were found taking merchandise and loading it into their Jeep Cherokee. What began as a burglary investigation would expose evidence connecting the couple to the missing persons case. The officers found weapons on both suspects. Benjamin had a 9mm handgun and a knife. Erica carried a .357 Magnum concealed behind her back in her jeans, as well as another knife. Inside the Jeep were additional items, including a .45 caliber firearm, ski masks, plastic restraints, duct tape, and other objects associated with restraint or concealment. The significance of those items became greater when investigators searched Erica's belongings. Erica told police that she needed her Xanax and Paxil. During the search for the medication, officers discovered 4 spent .357 Magnum shell casings and 1 live round. Then came the discovery that changed the investigation. Inside another small wallet in Erica's possession were identification documents belonging to Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. 2 people who had been missing since the Memorial Day weekend were now directly connected to one of the people arrested in an unrelated burglary. The discovery did not by itself establish every detail of what had happened to Ford and Crutchley, but it created a powerful investigative link. Investigators now had reason to look beyond the burglary and examine the Siffrits' movements, possessions, apartment, and relationship with the missing couple. The next step would be a search of the Siffrit apartment. There, investigators would find photographs of Erica and Benjamin with Ford and Crutchley, keys belonging to the victims, bullets connected to Erica's .357 Magnum, and evidence of blood in the bathroom. 1 bullet would contain blood and tissue belonging to Joshua Ford. The apartment would become the place where the scattered pieces of the investigation began to converge. The chance meeting on the bus was no longer simply a memory from a holiday weekend. The evening at Secrets was now part of the last known sequence of events in the lives of Ford and Crutchley. The missing wallet had become more than a dispute over personal property. The 3 a.m. 911 call had become an unsettling piece of the timeline. And the Hooters arrest had transformed an investigation into a disappearance into a case involving murder. Yet even with these discoveries, one fundamental question remained unanswered. What exactly had happened inside the Siffrit apartment after the 2 couples left Secrets? The prosecution would later present one explanation. Benjamin Siffrit would present another. Between those competing accounts stood the physical evidence, the firearms, the bullets, the identification documents, the keys, the photographs, and the traces left behind in the bathroom. The investigators would have to determine what those pieces could prove, what they could only suggest, and how they fit together into the final story of the night when Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley disappeared. The first days after Memorial Day did not immediately reveal what had happened to Joshua Edward Ford and Martha Jenny Crutchley. There was no complete account of their final hours, no recovered bodies, and no clear explanation for why 2 people who had traveled to Ocean City for a holiday had simply failed to return. Their disappearance existed first as an absence. Martha did not show up for work. Joshua did not return home. Their vehicle remained behind. Their personal belongings remained where they had been staying. And as investigators began assembling the available information, the ordinary details of a holiday weekend slowly gave way to a much more troubling possibility. The two had not simply chosen to leave. By May 28th, concerns surrounding Martha Crutchley's absence had become serious enough for her co-worker to contact authorities. Fairfax City Police were notified, and they in turn contacted Ocean City Police. The involvement of two police jurisdictions reflected the basic problem facing investigators. Ford and Crutchley had come to Ocean City from Virginia, so the investigation had to connect what was known about their lives at home with what had happened during their stay in Maryland. The first task was not yet to prove a murder. It was to determine where the couple had gone and why they had not returned. Investigators examined the circumstances surrounding their trip. The vehicle was still there. Their personal possessions were still at the accommodation. Those details mattered because people who voluntarily abandon a trip generally have some indication of departure. A vehicle moved somewhere else, belongings taken with them, communication with family or coworkers, or some other explanation for their absence. In the case of Ford and Crutchley, the information available to investigators offered none of those obvious explanations. Their belongings remained behind, creating a disturbing gap between where the couple was known to have been and where they were now. The investigation, therefore, had to work backward. Who had last seen them? Where had they gone after leaving their previous location? Had anyone traveled with them? Had anyone reported seeing them after the night of May 25th? At this stage, the meeting with Erica and Benjamin Sifrit was one piece of the larger timeline. The two couples had met on a bus heading towards Secrets. Ford and Crutchley had helped pay the Sifrits' fare because the couple did not have enough change, and the Sifrits were expected to buy them drinks. The four then continued to Secrets. This was important because it placed the victims and the Sifrits together during the last known period described in the supplied evidence. But a meeting between four strangers was not, by itself, proof of a crime. Investigators needed something more concrete. The case would eventually provide that evidence, but it did so through an unexpected route. Before police understood the significance of the Sifrit apartment, they would encounter the couple during a separate criminal investigation. On May 31st, near midnight, Ocean City Police responded to an alarm at a closed Hooters merchandise store. When officers arrived, they found Erica and Benjamin Sifrit taking merchandise from the store and placing it into their Jeep Cherokee. The initial circumstances appeared straightforward. This was a burglary investigation, but the search of the couple and their vehicle quickly produced a series of items that raised questions beyond the burglary itself. Benjamin was carrying a 9mm handgun and a knife. Erica had a .357 Magnum concealed behind her back in her jeans, along with another knife. Inside the Jeep, officers found a .45 caliber firearm, ski masks, plastic restraints, duct tape, and other items associated with restraint or concealment. None of those discoveries, considered alone, explained what had happened to Ford and Crutchley. But the investigation changed when police examined Erica's purse. Erica said she needed Xanax and Paxil. During the search for the medication, officers discovered Ford spent .357 Magnum shell casings and one live round. Then they found something far more important: identification belonging to Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. Suddenly, the missing person investigation and the burglary investigation intersected. The names in Erica's possession were not anonymous names from a random document. They belonged to the two people whose disappearance was already being investigated. The discovery created a direct investigative connection between the Sifrits and the missing couple. It did not, by itself, answer every question. It did not establish precisely when Ford and Crutchley died or exactly who had fired the shots. But it provided a reason to investigate the Sifrits much more closely. Police now had a concrete reason to examine the couple's apartment and search for additional evidence. That search would reveal that the connection was much deeper than two identification cards. Inside the Sifford apartment, investigators found photographs showing Erica and Benjamin with Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. The photographs were significant because they confirmed that the four had indeed spent time together, consistent with the earlier account of their meeting. But investigators also found 2 bullets near the photographs. Testing later determined that both had been fired from the .357 Magnum recovered from Erica. One of the bullets contained blood and tissue from Joshua Ford. The evidence was beginning to create a chain that connected the victims, Erica, the firearm, and the apartment. Investigators also found keys belonging to Ford and Crutchley. The meaning of those keys became particularly important because the couple's personal belongings had remained behind, while their apartment keys had apparently ended up in the possession of the Siffords. But the most significant evidence in the apartment was found in the bathroom. Technicians discovered blood in numerous locations: on the countertop, underneath the countertop, on the floor, beneath the cabinet, beneath the mirror, near the baseboard, around the bathtub, on the bathtub step, and throughout the bathroom area. The blood evidence was later determined to contain DNA consistent with Joshua Ford or Martha Crutchley. The bathroom also contained another physical clue: a hole in the wall behind the bathroom area. The surrounding area showed evidence that it had been painted again. On the floor were cleaning products, and some of those products had been purchased on May 26th, the day after Ford and Crutchley disappeared. Again, none of these discoveries provided investigators with a perfect recording of the events. Evidence can establish connections without explaining every moment. Blood could establish that the victims had been in the apartment, but it could not independently provide a complete narrative of the confrontation. The bullets could connect a firearm to Ford's death, but they did not answer every question about who had fired the weapon. The cleaning products could establish that cleaning activity occurred after the disappearance, but they did not independently establish who performed every act or exactly why. The investigation, therefore, depended on the totality of the evidence. One piece pointed toward another. The identification documents linked the victims to Erica. The photographs placed the 4 people together. The keys connected the victims to the Sifford apartment. The bullets connected Erica's firearm to evidence associated with Joshua Ford. The blood and DNA connected the victims to the bathroom. The apparent cleaning activity provided another element in the timeline. And then there was the ring. In Erica's possession, investigators found a silver ring bearing a dragon design. It was identified as belonging to Joshua Ford. Analysis found blood from both Ford and Crutchley on the ring. The ring became another physical bridge between the victims and Erica. By this stage, the investigation had moved far beyond the question of whether 2 people had voluntarily left Ocean City. Investigators were now looking at a series of physical objects that appeared to connect the missing, coupled to the Sifford apartment and to Erica personally. Yet one essential question remained: where were Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley? The apartment contained evidence suggesting that something violent had happened, but the victims themselves were not there. The investigation therefore entered its next stage, finding what remained of the 2 missing people and determining what could still be learned from those remains. The search would eventually extend beyond Maryland into Delaware, where investigators would find parts of the victims. For Joshua Ford, the recovery would include his torso and both arms. For Martha Crutchley, only her left leg would be recovered. The condition and incompleteness of the remains would make the reconstruction of the deaths even more difficult, but the evidence already gathered had changed the case permanently. What began as the unexplained absence of 2 holiday travelers had become a murder investigation centered on an apartment. A firearm, a ring, identification cards, blood, DNA, and a chain of events that led investigators from Ocean City to Delaware. The chance meeting on a bus was now no longer an incidental detail. It had become the beginning of the last known chapter in the lives of Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. And as investigators continued, the question was no longer simply where the couple had gone. It was what had happened to them after they entered the world of the Sifrits. By the night of May 31st, the investigation into the disappearance of Joshua Edward Ford and Martha Jenny Crutchley had reached a difficult stage. The couple had been missing since the Memorial Day weekend. Their vehicle and personal belongings remained behind, but investigators still did not have a complete explanation for what had happened to them. The circumstances surrounding their disappearance were troubling, yet the case needed something concrete that could connect the missing people to a specific suspect or location. That breakthrough came from an incident that, on the surface, had nothing to do with the disappearance. Near midnight on May 31st, Ocean City police received an alarm from a closed Hooters merchandise store. When officers arrived, they encountered Erica Sifrit and Benjamin Sifrit. The two were taking merchandise from the store and placing it into their Jeep Cherokee. At that moment, the police were dealing with what appeared to be a burglary and theft. There was no obvious reason, at first, to believe that the encounter would become the turning point in a double murder investigation. But the search of the Sifrits and their vehicle produced a series of discoveries that would soon change the entire direction of the case. Benjamin was carrying a 9mm handgun and a knife. Erica was carrying a .357 Magnum concealed behind her back in her jeans. She also had another knife. The presence of firearms was immediately significant because this was not simply a question of stolen merchandise. Investigators now had to consider the possibility that the people they had detained were carrying weapons in connection with something beyond the burglary. The search continued. Inside the Jeep Cherokee, officers found a .45 caliber firearm, ski masks, plastic restraints, duct tape, and other items associated with restraint or concealment. Those discoveries did not establish that these objects had been used against Joshua Ford or Martha Crutchley. It would be important not to confuse suspicious circumstances with proof. But taken together, the items gave investigators reason to examine the Sifrits more closely. The most important discovery, however, was not initially found in the Jeep. It was inside Erica Sifrit's belongings. Erica told police that she needed her Xanax and Paxil. During the search for the medication, an officer examined her purse. Inside were 4 spent .357 Magnum shell casings and 1 live round. The ammunition immediately became significant because Erica was also carrying a .357 Magnum. But the discovery that followed was even more important. In another small wallet inside Erica's possession, officers found identification documents belonging to Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. The two people whose disappearance had already been reported were now physically connected to Erica Sifrit. This was not an abstract connection based on rumor or an unconfirmed sighting. Their identification was in her belongings. The significance of the discovery was immediate. Investigators had been trying to determine what had happened to two people who had disappeared after a holiday weekend. Now, during an unrelated burglary arrest, they had found property belonging to both missing people in the possession of one of the people known to have met them on the night they disappeared. The investigation could no longer treat the Sifrits simply as people arrested for a separate offense. Their relationship with Ford and Crutchley had to be examined in detail. The next logical step was the Sifrit apartment. Investigators now had a reason to search the place where the two couples had reportedly spent time. After leaving secrets, what they found there would provide the physical evidence that the identification cards alone could not. Inside the apartment were photographs showing Erica and Benjamin with Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. The photographs confirmed the connection between the four people and provided investigators with a visual record of their association. More importantly, the photographs were accompanied by 2 bullets. Testing later established that both bullets had been fired from the .357 Magnum recovered from Erica at the Hooters scene. One of those bullets contained blood and tissue belonging to Joshua Ford. The discovery created a direct ballistic and biological connection between Ford and the weapon Erica had been carrying when she was arrested. It was one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. But investigators were not finished. They also discovered keys belonging to Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. Their presence in the Sifford apartment added another connection between the missing couple and the location. Ford and Crutchley had left behind their personal belongings at their accommodation, yet their keys had ended up in the possession of the Siffords. Again, the significance came from the combination of evidence. One object might have been questioned. Multiple independent pieces of evidence pointing in the same direction created a much stronger investigative picture. Then investigators turned their attention to the bathroom. The bathroom became one of the most important areas in the entire case because forensic technicians found blood in numerous locations. Blood was discovered on the countertop and beneath it. There were traces on the floor and underneath the cabinet. Blood was also found beneath the mirror, near the baseboard, around the bathtub, on the step of the bathtub, and throughout the bathroom. Subsequent testing determined that the blood included DNA consistent with Joshua Ford or Martha Crutchley. The evidence indicated that the victims had been inside the apartment and that the bathroom was directly connected to the events under investigation. There was also a hole in the wall behind the bathroom. The surrounding area showed signs that it had been painted again. On the floor, investigators found cleaning products. According to the supplied case information, some of those cleaning products had been purchased on May 26th, the day after Ford and Crutchley disappeared. The significance of that date was difficult to ignore. The investigation had established a sequence in which two people disappeared during the night of May 25th to 26th, and cleaning products were purchased on May 26th. Inside the apartment, investigators found blood evidence and a damaged wall in the bathroom. Yet even then, investigators had to distinguish evidence from interpretation. The presence of cleaning products did not independently establish every action that had taken place. The evidence had to be considered alongside everything else. The same was true of the ammunition. The spent .357 casings found with Erica, the .357 itself, and the bullets associated with Joshua Ford created a powerful connection. But the evidence did not automatically answer every question about who had pulled the trigger in every moment of the killings. That question would become especially important during the trials. The physical evidence continued to accumulate. Among Erica's belongings, investigators found a silver ring with a dragon design. The ring was identified as belonging to Joshua Ford. DNA analysis showed blood from both Ford and Crutchley on the ring. Another object had now joined the chain connecting the missing couple to Erica. The identification documents connected them. The keys connected them. The photographs placed them together. The ring connected Erica directly to an item belonging to Ford. The blood and DNA connected the victims to the bathroom. The ballistic evidence connected Ford to Erica's .357 Magnum. And the cleaning products and signs of repainting provided additional context for what investigators believe had happened inside the apartment after the disappearance. At this point, the case had transformed. The police were no longer searching blindly for two missing holiday travelers. They had evidence indicating that Ford and Crutchley had been inside the Sifford apartment and that the apartment contained traces associated with their deaths. But one major problem remained. The victims themselves had not been fully recovered. Investigators needed to know where the bodies had gone. That question would lead them beyond Ocean City and into Delaware. The eventual recovery of remains would provide further evidence, including bullets from Joshua Ford's torso that were linked to Erica's .357 Magnum. For Martha Crutchley, only her left leg would ultimately be recovered. The incomplete nature of the remains would make the reconstruction of her death especially difficult. Still, the evidence gathered from the Sifford apartment had already established a crucial foundation. The case had begun with two people who disappeared after meeting strangers during a holiday weekend. It had progressed through a missing person report and then taken an unexpected turn when the Siffords were arrested for burglary. The Hooters investigation had uncovered weapons, ammunition, and identification documents belonging to the missing couple. The apartment search then uncovered photographs, keys, a ring, bullets, blood, DNA evidence. and signs of activity in the bathroom. Each discovery answered one question while creating another. Why did Erica have the victim's identification? Why did she have Ford's ring? Why was her .357 connected to bullets associated with Ford? Why was there blood matching the victims inside the apartment? And what had happened to their bodies afterward? The investigation was now moving toward those questions. But there was still another source of evidence waiting to emerge. The people who had encountered the Sifrits after the murders. One of them was Melissa Selling, whose testimony would later provide a disturbing account of what she saw and heard inside the Sifrit apartment. Her story would add another layer to the physical evidence and would become important during the legal proceedings that followed. The Hooters burglary had begun as an unrelated crime. By the end of May 31st, it had become the event that exposed the connection between Erica and Benjamin Sifrit and two missing people. The case had found its first decisive thread, and investigators now had to follow it wherever it led. The arrest of Erica and Benjamin Sifrit on May 31st had changed the investigation. But an arrest was not an explanation. Police now had the identification of Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley in Erica's possession, weapons in the possession of both suspects, and a growing reason to believe that the Sifrits were connected to the couple's disappearance. The next question was where that connection had become a crime. Investigators focused on the Sifrit apartment. It was there, according to the prosecution's theory, that the final confrontation had taken place. And it was there that forensic evidence would provide some of the strongest links between the missing couple and the Sifrits. The apartment did not contain a single piece of evidence that explained everything. Instead, investigators found a collection of separate objects and traces. Each one had its own significance. Together, they created a picture that was difficult to dismiss. Among the first important discoveries were photographs. On a glass table inside the apartment, investigators found photographs showing Erica and Benjamin Sifrit together with Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. The photographs confirmed something that had already been suggested by the identification found in Erica's belongings. The two couples had spent time together. They had not simply crossed paths briefly on a crowded street and never seen one another again. Their connection extended into the Sifrit apartment. The photographs, therefore, became part of the timeline, placing the four people together in the same environment. But the objects next to those photographs were even more significant. 2 bullets were found on the glass table. Later examination determined that both had been fired from the .357 Magnum recovered from Erica during the Hooters burglary arrest. One of those bullets contained blood and tissue belonging to Joshua Ford. The ballistic evidence created a direct connection between the firearm Erica had been carrying and physical evidence associated with Ford. It did not, by itself, establish every detail of the shooting, but it narrowed the possibilities dramatically. Investigators were no longer dealing only with a missing man whose identification had somehow ended up in Erica's possession. They now had a firearm connected to Erica and ballistic evidence connected to Joshua Ford. Another discovery strengthened the connection. Police found keys belonging to Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. The keys were significant because they represented another piece of property that had moved from the possession of the missing couple to the Sifrit apartment. The more investigators searched, the harder it became to view the relationship between the two couples as a brief and insignificant encounter. There were now photographs, identification documents, keys, and a ring belonging to Ford, all linking the victims to Erica and Benjamin. Then investigators examined the bathroom. The bathroom became one of the central locations in the case because forensic technicians found blood in numerous areas. Blood was detected on the countertop and underneath the countertop. There were traces on the floor, beneath the cabinet, and underneath the mirror. Additional blood was found near the baseboard, around the bathtub, and on the step leading into the bathtub. These were not isolated traces in a single location. They were distributed across the bathroom area. Subsequent testing determined that the blood contained DNA consistent with Joshua Ford or Martha Crutchley. The bathroom evidence therefore connected the victims directly to the apartment and to a location that investigators believed was central to the events of the night. Yet forensic evidence has limits. Blood can establish that a person was present and that an injury occurred, but it cannot always tell investigators exactly what happened in every second that preceded or followed the injury. The investigators had to interpret the physical evidence together with witness accounts, ballistic evidence, and the later statements of the defendants. This distinction became especially important because the two defendants would not present identical accounts of what happened. Another unusual discovery inside the bathroom was a hole in the wall. The area around the hole showed signs that it had been painted again. Investigators also found cleaning products on the floor. According to the case information, some of those cleaning products had been purchased on May 26th, the day after Ford and Crutchley disappeared. The date placed the cleaning activity close to the critical period in the investigation. If the victims had been killed during the night of May 25th to 26th, then cleaning products purchased on May 26th and evidence of repainting in the bathroom became significant elements in the prosecution's interpretation of the scene. Again, however, the evidence had to be considered carefully. The presence of cleaning products did not independently prove who had used them or exactly what they were intended to remove. The importance came from their relationship to the other discoveries. Investigators were reconstructing a sequence from fragments. The missing couple had met the Sifrits on May 25th. The four people had gone to Secrets. A 911 call had been made by Erica at approximately 3 in the morning on May 26th, involving unknown people in her apartment and a missing wallet. Ford and Crutchley did not return to their accommodation. Their belongings remained behind. On May 31st, Erica and Benjamin were arrested at the Hooters store. Erica was carrying their identification. She also had a .357 Magnum and spent ammunition. The apartment then contained photographs of the four people, bullets fired from that weapon, blood and DNA associated with the victims, keys belonging to the victims, and Ford's ring. The physical evidence was becoming a chain. One of the most striking links was the ring. Investigators found a silver ring with a dragon design in Erica's possession. It was identified as belonging to Joshua Ford. Analysis found blood from both Ford and Crutchley on the ring. That finding was particularly important because the ring was not simply an object that could be associated with the victims through identification. It was a personal possession of Ford, found with Erica, and it carried biological evidence associated with both victims. The ring therefore became another bridge between the victims and the suspect. At this stage, investigators had evidence connecting the victims to the apartment, but there was still a major absence: the bodies. The apartment could provide clues, but the victims themselves were missing. The investigation eventually established that the bodies had been divided and discarded. Remains were recovered from a landfill in Delaware. The condition of the remains made the forensic investigation more difficult. Only the left leg of Martha Crutchley was recovered. In the case of Joshua Ford, investigators recovered his torso and both arms. The incomplete recovery meant that not every question about the deaths could be answered through forensic examination. In Crutchley's case especially, determining the full cause of death was difficult because so little of her body was recovered. Ford's remains, however, contained additional evidence. 2 bullets were recovered from his torso. Testing determined that the bullets had been fired from the .357 Magnum found on Erica at the time of the Hooters arrest. That finding strengthened the ballistic connection already established by the bullets found in the apartment. The weapon was not simply a firearm that Erica happened to possess. It was associated with bullets recovered from Ford's remains and with other evidence inside the Sifford apartment. The investigation had therefore moved from a missing person case into a homicide case supported by multiple categories of evidence: biological, ballistic, photographic, and physical. Yet one question remained at the center of the investigation: who had actually killed Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley? The evidence connected Erica and Benjamin to the aftermath. But the precise division of responsibility between them would become a major issue at trial. Prosecutors argued that the couple acted together. Benjamin would later acknowledge participating in the disposal and division of the bodies, but deny killing the victims himself. His account would become one of the most consequential parts of the case. Before the trials, however, investigators would hear from another person who had encountered the Sifrits only days after the murders. Melissa Selling would describe what happened when she went with Erica and Benjamin to their apartment. On May 29th, she would recall the missing wallet story, the presence of a firearm, and statements that she interpreted as threats. Her testimony would provide something the physical evidence could not: a description of the Sifrits' behavior and words after the killings. That testimony would become particularly important because the physical evidence could establish that something terrible had happened, but it could not speak. It could not explain motive. It could not describe what Benjamin believed. It could not tell the jury what Erica and Benjamin said to another person in the days following the disappearance. For that, prosecutors needed witnesses. The case was now moving from the apartment itself toward the people who had interacted with the Sifrits after May 25th. And as investigators continued building the timeline, the central mystery was becoming clearer in one sense and more complicated in another. There was strong evidence that Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley had been inside the Sifrit apartment, and that violence had occurred there. There was evidence linking Erica's firearm to Ford's death. There was evidence connecting both victims to Erica's belongings. But exactly how the killings unfolded, who fired which shots, and what each defendant knew or intended remained questions that would ultimately have to be answered in court. The apartment had given investigators the physical foundation of the case. The next stage would depend on human testimony and on whether those testimonies could fill the gaps left by the evidence that time and the destruction of the victims' remains had made impossible to recover. The physical evidence recovered from the Sifrit apartment gave investigators a framework for understanding what had happened to Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. But physical evidence could not answer every question. It could show that blood was present. It could connect bullets to a firearm. It could identify belongings. It could place people together through photographs and possessions. But evidence found on a table or beneath a bathroom cabinet could not explain what Erica and Benjamin Sifrit were saying or thinking after the disappearance. For that, investigators needed witnesses. One of the most important witnesses to emerge was Melissa Selling. Her encounter with the Sifrits occurred several days after the disappearance of Ford and Crutchley. On May 29th, Selling would eventually provide testimony about what she saw inside the Sifrit apartment and, more importantly, what Benjamin said while she was there. Her account became another piece of the prosecution's case, although like all witness testimony, it also contained limits and uncertainties that would later be examined in court. On the night of May 29th, Selling was with Benjamin and Erica Sifrit and a man named Todd. According to her testimony, she was the only person in the group who had not been drinking. At some point, she became concerned that Benjamin was not in a condition to drive safely. Rather than allow him to drive, she agreed to go with them to the apartment. The decision placed her inside the same apartment that investigators would later identify as central to the murders. At the time, however, Selling did not know the full significance of the place she had entered. She was not walking into a known crime scene. She was accompanying people she had encountered socially, and there was no reason for her to expect what would happen next. When they arrived, Erica appeared very intoxicated and needed assistance getting inside. At first, according to Selling's account, the situation seemed ordinary enough. But that changed within minutes. Erica and Benjamin began talking about Erica's missing wallet. The same basic explanation had appeared in Erica's 911 call on May 26th, when she reported that people she did not know were inside her apartment and that she could not find her wallet. Now, days later, the missing wallet remained a subject of discussion. Selling was asked to help look for it. The request might initially have seemed harmless. A person loses a wallet, becomes frustrated, and asks friends or acquaintances to help locate it. But then Benjamin produced a firearm. The presence of the weapon transformed the atmosphere. Selling described feeling threatened. Benjamin began speaking about people who had previously attempted to deceive, cheat, or take advantage of him and Erica. According to Selling, Benjamin framed his actions as a way of dealing with people he considered bad or dishonest. He spoke about removing bad people from the world and presented himself as someone who believed he was doing what was right by eliminating them. For Selling, the words were not abstract. She was standing inside an apartment with a man holding a gun. She understood that the situation could become dangerous and asked him to put the weapon away. Her testimony gave investigators something the physical evidence could not: an account of Benjamin's behavior and language in the days immediately following the disappearance. Selling also saw a significant feature of the apartment. She observed a bullet hole in the bathroom door. That detail became important because investigators had already found a hole in the bathroom area during their examination of the apartment. The witness's description therefore corresponded with physical evidence documented by investigators. The apartment itself contained other signs that would later be examined: blood traces throughout the bathroom, bullets associated with Erica's .357 Magnum, and evidence that cleaning had occurred. Selling did not necessarily understand the significance of everything she saw at the time. But when investigators later reconstructed the case, her observations became part of the larger picture. The most disturbing portion of Selling's testimony concerned what Benjamin said about people who might attempt to deceive the Sifrits. She recalled Benjamin threatening that if she and Todd tried to deceive them, he would kill them in the same way as other people. Yet even here, the precise wording became important. At trial, Selling acknowledged that she was not completely certain whether Benjamin had said something equivalent to "as I killed other people" or "as we killed other people." That distinction mattered because the prosecution was trying to establish not merely that Benjamin knew about the murders, but that he was directly involved in them. A statement using "I" could suggest personal responsibility. A statement using "we" could suggest joint responsibility. The uncertainty did not necessarily destroy the value of the testimony, but it demonstrated why courtroom evidence must be examined carefully. A witness can remember the substance of a threatening statement while remaining uncertain about an exact word. The defense could use that uncertainty to challenge the prosecution's interpretation. The prosecution, meanwhile, could point to the broader circumstances in which the statement had been made. Selling was not describing a conversation from years earlier. She was describing an encounter occurring only days after Ford and Crutchley disappeared, inside the apartment where investigators later found evidence connected to the victims. The context therefore mattered. Selling's testimony did not stand alone. It existed alongside the physical evidence. Investigators had already found identification documents belonging to Ford and Crutchley in Erica's possession. They had found Ford's ring, with blood from both victims on it. They had found photographs of the four people together. They had found the victims' keys. They had found blood and DNA evidence in the bathroom. They had connected bullets from Joshua Ford's remains to Erica's .357 Magnum. And now there was a witness describing Benjamin with a firearm and recounting statements about people who might be treated as enemies. Each category of evidence had limitations, but together they formed the foundation of the prosecution's argument that the Sifrits were not merely involved in the disposal of bodies after an unrelated event. They were part of the events that had led to the deaths. Still, the case did not provide investigators with a simple, uncontested narrative. Benjamin would eventually offer a different account. He would acknowledge that he participated in the division and disposal of the bodies, but he would deny that he had killed Ford or Crutchley. According to his later testimony, he returned to the apartment after being awakened by Erica and found the two victims already dead in the bathroom. He claimed that he had not shot them. Instead, he said that he became involved afterward and even proposed the idea of dividing the bodies. That distinction was crucial. If Benjamin's account were accepted, his conduct could still make him criminally responsible for what happened afterward. but it would challenge the prosecution's argument that he personally committed the killings. The jury would therefore have to consider not only what the physical evidence demonstrated, but also whether Benjamin's explanation was credible. The same problem existed with Erica. She was the person found carrying the .357 Magnum connected to bullets recovered from Ford. She possessed identification belonging to both victims. She possessed Ford's ring. Evidence connected the victims to her apartment. Yet the precise sequence of events remained dependent on the interpretation of those facts. The investigation was becoming a contest between competing explanations. The prosecution's theory was that Erica and Benjamin acted together. Benjamin's eventual defense was that he was involved after the murders rather than being the killer. And the testimony of Melissa Selling provided prosecutors with another way to challenge the idea that Benjamin had simply stumbled upon a crime after it had already happened. Her account placed him inside the apartment, armed, speaking about people who might be eliminated if they tried to deceive him. It also placed him in an environment where the bathroom evidence would later become central. Selling could not tell investigators exactly what happened to Ford and Crutchley on May 25th. She had not witnessed the killings. She could not identify who fired the shots. But her testimony filled part of the period between the disappearance and the arrests. She provided a glimpse of the Sifrit's behavior after the victims were gone. That glimpse mattered because murder investigations are often built from such fragments. A witness remembers a sentence. A technician documents a bloodstain. A detective finds an identification card. A laboratory connects a bullet to a weapon. None of these pieces tells the entire story. But when they are placed together, they can reveal a pattern. In the Sifrit case, the pattern was becoming increasingly difficult for investigators to ignore. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley had disappeared after meeting Erica and Benjamin. Their property had appeared in Erica's possession. Evidence associated with them was found inside the Sifrit apartment. Their blood and DNA were present in the bathroom. Ford's ring was found with Erica. His remains contained bullets fired from Erica's weapon. And days after the disappearance, Melissa Selling described Benjamin holding a gun and making statements about eliminating people he considered dishonest. The case was no longer simply about locating two missing tourists. Investigators were now building a homicide prosecution. But the final question remained the most difficult one. What exactly did each Sifrit do? The answer would not come from a single witness or a single forensic test. It would emerge through the competing accounts presented at trial. Beginning with Benjamin Sifrit's own explanation of the night when Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley died. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the physical evidence had established a difficult set of facts, but it had not answered every question about responsibility. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley were dead. Their remains had been divided and discarded. Evidence connected both victims to the Sifrit apartment. Erica Sifrit had possessed their identification, Ford's ring, and the .357 Magnum associated with bullets recovered from Ford. Blood and DNA consistent with the victims had been found in the bathroom. Yet one question remained at the center of Benjamin Sifrit's defense. Had Benjamin actually killed either of them? His answer was no. Benjamin acknowledged that he had participated in what happened after the killings, but he denied being the person who shot Ford and Crutchley. His account offered a version of events that differed significantly from the prosecution's theory, and became one of the most important issues the jury had to consider. According to Benjamin's testimony, after the night at Secrets, he did not immediately return to the apartment with the others. He said that he returned alone and did not have a key to the apartment. Because of that, he claimed that he slept in the Jeep Cherokee. At some point, Erica woke him. Benjamin then returned to the apartment. What he said he encountered there was not an argument in progress or two people being threatened with a firearm. Instead, he testified that Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley were already dead in the bathroom. Benjamin insisted that he had not killed them. This claim placed him in a difficult position. Even if the jury accepted his assertion that he had not fired the shots, he still admitted conduct that was extraordinarily serious. He acknowledged participating in the disposal of the bodies. More than that, he testified that he was the person who suggested dividing the bodies. According to his account, the decision was made after he discovered the victims had already been killed. He and Erica then participated in the handling of the remains. The bodies were placed into garbage bags and eventually transported to a dumpster in the Food Lion area of Rehoboth, Delaware. The prosecution could therefore not simply portray Benjamin as an uninvolved bystander. His own account placed him inside the chain of events after the deaths. The dispute was over exactly where his criminal responsibility began. Benjamin's version required the jury to accept several propositions. First, that Erica had killed Ford and Crutchley without Benjamin participating in the killings. Second, that Benjamin returned afterward and discovered what had happened. Third, that despite not committing the murders, he chose to participate in concealing the evidence and disposing of the bodies. The prosecution, however, argued that this explanation did not fit the larger body of evidence. The state's theory was that Benjamin and Erica acted together. Their relationship, the evidence inside the apartment, the disposal of the bodies, and the testimony of Melissa Selling were presented as parts of a common course of conduct rather than two completely separate phases carried out by one killer and one person who arrived afterward. The question for the jury was therefore not simply whether Benjamin had handled the bodies. He admitted that. The question was whether his role extended to the killings themselves or, at minimum, whether his conduct made him criminally responsible for the offenses with which he was charged. Another piece of evidence introduced against Benjamin came from his past. Prosecutors called Michael McInnes, a former Navy SEAL who had known Benjamin. McInnes described a conversation he had with Benjamin in 1999, approximately 3 years before the Ocean City murders. The conversation involved the subject of what someone might do with a body after committing a killing. According to McInnes, Benjamin had described a method involving dividing a body into multiple parts, placing the parts into separate bags, and disposing of them in different locations. When presented in the context of the Sifrit case, the similarity was striking. Benjamin was accused of participating in precisely such conduct after Ford and Crutchley were killed. The prosecution used the earlier conversation as evidence relevant to Benjamin's intent and his participation in the disposal of the victims. But even this testimony had an important limitation. McInnes acknowledged that the conversation could have been nothing more than talk between men who had been drinking. There was no evidence that the 1999 conversation was an actual plan to kill anyone. It was a discussion about what might be done if someone committed a murder. The defense could therefore argue that the conversation was speculative and did not prove that Benjamin had planned or committed the 2002 murders. The prosecution, however, could point to the striking similarity between the hypothetical method described in 1999 and the conduct Benjamin later admitted to in 2002. The jury was left to determine what weight that evidence deserved. This became an important feature of the case. Much of the evidence was powerful because of how separate pieces fit together, but individual pieces did not necessarily prove the entire prosecution theory on their own. The physical evidence connected the victims to the apartment. The firearm evidence connected Ford to Erica's .357 Magnum. The identification documents connected the victims to Erica's possessions. The ring connected Ford and Crutchley to Erica through both ownership and DNA. Melissa Selling described Benjamin with a firearm and recalled statements about eliminating people he considered dishonest. McInnes described a previous conversation about disposing of a body, and Benjamin himself admitted to dividing and disposing of the victim's remains. But the precise question of who fired the fatal shots remained contested. Benjamin's testimony attempted to create a boundary between the killings and the concealment. In his version, Erica was responsible for the deaths, while he became involved afterward. That distinction mattered enormously because the law treated the different forms of participation differently. His later conviction demonstrated that the jury did not simply accept his account as a complete explanation of his responsibility. On April 9, 2003, Benjamin was convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Martha Crutchley. He was also convicted of first-degree assault involving Crutchley and of being an accessory after the fact in connection with the murders. But there was a crucial limitation to the verdict. Benjamin was acquitted of the murder of Joshua Ford and of the related charges concerning Ford. The result demonstrated that the jury did not simply accept the prosecution's entire case without distinction. Benjamin was held criminally responsible for Martha Crutchley's death, while the jury found insufficient grounds to convict him of murdering Joshua Ford. That distinction is important when describing the case accurately. It would be incorrect to reduce the verdict to the simple statement that Benjamin was convicted of killing both victims. He was not. His legal responsibility for the two deaths was treated differently. The verdict also showed why the competing accounts mattered. The jury had to evaluate whether the evidence established Benjamin's responsibility beyond the required legal standard for each victim and each charge. The fact that he admitted disposing of the bodies was significant, but it did not automatically establish that he had personally killed both people. Similarly, the presence of Erica's firearm and evidence associated with it did not by itself resolve every question concerning Benjamin's conduct. The prosecution therefore relied on the broader circumstances to argue that the two defendants had acted together. The defense relied on the gaps in the reconstruction and Benjamin's account that he had returned. After the killings, the legal process ultimately produced a mixed result for Benjamin. He was not acquitted across the board, but neither was the prosecution's entire theory accepted against him. The jury drew a distinction between Martha Crutchley and Joshua Ford, convicting Benjamin of second-degree murder in Crutchley's death while acquitting him of Ford's murder. The other convictions addressed his conduct surrounding the case. Later, Maryland's highest court would review legal issues arising from the trial and sentencing. The appellate proceedings would consider, among other matters, arguments concerning the prosecution's theories, the admission of evidence, and the relationship between the different charges. The courts ultimately maintained the essential convictions against Benjamin, while modifying how certain sentences were treated. But before those later legal questions could be resolved, another trial awaited. Erica Siffert would face the jury separately. Unlike Benjamin, she had been found carrying the .357 Magnum that was connected to bullets recovered from Ford. Her possession of the victim's identification and Ford's ring would also be central to the prosecution's case. The evidence found in the apartment would again be examined, but this time through the question of Erica's own responsibility. The two defendants had shared the same apartment, the same victims, and the same chain of events. Yet the legal outcomes would be very different. Benjamin had received a mixed verdict, including an acquittal on Ford's murder. Erica's trial would produce convictions for both victims, with the most serious charge being first-degree murder for Joshua Ford. The case was therefore moving into its second courtroom chapter. Benjamin's testimony had attempted to separate the act of killing from the act of disposing of the bodies. The jury had rejected enough of that distinction to convict him of serious offenses, while still acquitting him of Ford's murder. Now prosecutors would have to present their case against Erica, and the evidence already discovered during the investigation would take on an even more direct significance. After Benjamin Siffert's trial produced a mixed verdict, the focus shifted to Erica Siffert. Her trial would examine many of the same facts, but the evidence took on a different significance because Erica had been found carrying the .357 Magnum connected to bullets recovered from Joshua Ford, and because several items belonging to the missing couple had been found in her possession. The prosecution's case was therefore built around a collection of physical evidence, witness testimony, and the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Ford and Martha, Jenny Crutchley. The question before the jury was not simply whether Erica knew the victims. That fact was already established. The photographs found inside the apartment showed the two couples together. The question was whether Erica had participated in their murders, and if so, what degree of responsibility the evidence established. The prosecution presented the sequence as a connected chain. Ford and Crutchley met Erica and Benjamin during the Memorial Day weekend. The four eventually spent time together at Secrets and, according to the prosecution's theory, later returned to the Sifford apartment. Afterward, Ford and Crutchley disappeared. Their vehicle and belongings remained behind. Erica subsequently possessed identification belonging to both victims, as well as Ford's ring. Inside the Sifford apartment, investigators found photographs of the four together, bullets fired from Erica's .357 Magnum, and biological evidence connected to the victims. In the remains recovered later in Delaware, investigators found additional evidence linking Ford's death to that same firearm. Each piece had a separate meaning. The prosecution argued that, taken together, they established Erica's participation in the killings and the subsequent concealment of what had happened. The .357 Magnum was especially important. Police recovered the weapon from Erica when she and Benjamin were arrested during the Hooters burglary on May 31st. She had concealed it behind her back in her jeans. She also possessed 4 spent .357 Magnum shell casings and 1 live round. Investigators later connected the weapon to bullets associated with Ford. 2 bullets found in Ford's torso were determined to have been fired from the .357 Magnum. Another bullet associated with the same weapon had been found inside the Sifford apartment and contained blood and tissue from Ford. The significance of the evidence was not merely that Erica possessed a firearm. It was that the firearm in her possession was connected through ballistic testing to bullets recovered from the remains of one of the missing people. The prosecution also relied heavily on the property found in Erica's possession. Identification belonging to both Ford and Crutchley had been discovered in her belongings. Ford's silver dragon ring was also found with her, and testing showed blood from both victims on the ring. These discoveries created a direct physical connection between Erica and objects that had belonged to the missing couple. The defense, however, still had to contend with the question of what these objects actually proved. Possessing a victim's property can demonstrate involvement in events surrounding a crime, but it does not necessarily answer every question about how or when a death occurred. The prosecution therefore returned to the apartment itself. The bathroom contained blood in numerous locations. Forensic technicians found blood on and beneath the countertop, on the floor, beneath the cabinet and mirror, near the baseboard, around the bathtub, and on the bathtub step. DNA testing determined that the blood was consistent with Joshua Ford or Martha Crutchley. There was also a hole in the bathroom wall and evidence that the surrounding area had been painted. Again, cleaning products were found in the apartment, and some had been purchased on May 26th, immediately after the disappearance. The physical evidence suggested that the bathroom had been the scene of significant violence and that efforts had been made afterward to clean or alter the area. Yet the prosecution still had to establish Erica's individual role. The state's theory was that Erica and Benjamin had acted together. According to the prosecution, the dispute began with the claim that Erica's wallet had disappeared. The wallet became the focus of a confrontation involving Ford and Crutchley. The argument escalated, and the victims were taken into the bathroom area. Guns were used and both victims were killed. The bodies were subsequently divided and discarded. The prosecution did not claim that every moment of this sequence could be reconstructed with absolute certainty. The victims could not testify. The remains were incomplete. The physical evidence could establish connections, but it could not provide a perfect account of every action. That limitation was an important part of the legal debate surrounding the case. Nevertheless, prosecutors argued that the combined evidence was sufficient to establish Erica's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Her possession of the victim's property was difficult to separate from the other evidence. The ring was particularly significant because it was Ford's personal possession and contained blood from both victims. The identification documents belonged to 2 people who had disappeared. The .357 Magnum was carried by Erica when police arrested her, and bullets from that weapon were associated with Ford's remains and with evidence in the apartment. These were not isolated facts. They formed a chain extending from the victims to Erica and from Erica to the apartment where the blood evidence was found. The prosecution also had the testimony of Melissa Selling. Although Selling did not witness the murders, she described her encounter with the Sifrits on May 29th, only days after Ford and Crutchley disappeared. She described Erica as apparently very intoxicated when they arrived at the apartment and recalled the discussion about Erica's missing wallet. She also described Benjamin producing a firearm and making statements about people who had tried to deceive or take advantage of them. Selling's account of the bullet hole in the bathroom was significant because investigators had documented a corresponding feature in the apartment. Her testimony therefore provided context for the physical evidence, even though she could not personally describe the murders. The prosecution's broader theory was that Erica and Benjamin were acting together rather than independently. That theory also had to account for Benjamin's own testimony from his trial. Benjamin had claimed that when he returned to the apartment, Ford and Crutchley were already dead. He denied killing them, but admitted that he suggested dividing the bodies and participated in their disposal. The prosecution argued that his admitted participation did not make sense as the behavior of an innocent person who had unexpectedly discovered two bodies. Instead, prosecutors presented it as evidence of a joint effort to conceal the killings. The earlier testimony of Michael McInnes was also relevant to the prosecution's portrayal of Benjamin, although it was primarily significant in Benjamin's own proceedings. McInnes had described a 1999 conversation in which Benjamin discussed dividing a body and disposing of the parts in separate places. That evidence supported the prosecution's argument concerning Benjamin's participation in the disposal, but it did not by itself establish what Erica had done. Her responsibility had to be established through the evidence against her. The trial therefore returned repeatedly to the same physical objects: the firearm, the bullets, the ring, the identification documents, the keys, and the biological evidence. Each object represented a piece of the missing couple's final hours. The prosecution argued that Erica's possession of those items, combined with the evidence from the apartment and the ballistic findings, was too extensive to be explained as an innocent association. The defense, meanwhile, had to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of the evidence and the conclusions being drawn from circumstances that could not be observed directly. Ultimately, the jury reached its decision. On June 10, 2003, Erica Sifrit was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Joshua Ford and second-degree murder in the death of Martha Crutchley. She was also convicted of related theft offenses. The verdict established a substantially greater level of criminal responsibility for Erica than the verdict against Benjamin. She received life imprisonment for the murder of Joshua Ford, followed by an additional 20 years for the murder of Martha Crutchley. The different outcomes of the two trials were striking. Benjamin had been convicted of second-degree murder involving Crutchley, but acquitted of Ford's murder. Erica was convicted of murdering both victims, with the most serious conviction being first-degree murder for Ford. The verdicts demonstrated that the legal system did not treat the two defendants as interchangeable, simply because they were married and had been involved in the same events. Each was judged according to the evidence presented against that individual. For Erica, the combination of the .357 Magnum, the bullets, the victim's identification, Ford's ring, the DNA evidence, the photographs, and the circumstances surrounding the disappearance proved decisive. Yet the case was not finished with the verdict. Both defendants would challenge their convictions, and the Maryland appellate courts would later examine important legal questions arising from the trials. Those proceedings would address the prosecution's theories, evidentiary issues, and the relationship between the different charges. The Sifrit case therefore continued beyond the courtroom where the juries reached their verdicts. But by June 2003, one central fact had been established through the criminal proceedings. Erica Sifrit had been found legally responsible for the murders of both Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley. The investigation that began with two missing people had ended, at least at the trial level, with a life sentence. The next chapter would move away from the question of guilt and toward the appeals that tested whether those convictions and sentences would stand. The convictions of Erica and Benjamin Sifrit did not bring the legal history of the case to an immediate end. A criminal trial answers a specific set of questions for a jury, but after a conviction, the defendants have the right to challenge legal errors they believe occurred during the proceedings. In the Sifrit case, those appeals became important because the two defendants had received very different verdicts despite being prosecuted for the same underlying events. Benjamin had been convicted of second-degree murder in the death of Martha Jenny Crutchley, along with other offenses connected to the case, but he had been acquitted of the murder of Joshua Ford. Erica, by contrast, had been convicted of first-degree murder for Ford and second-degree murder for Crutchley. Their sentences reflected those different findings. The appeals therefore required the courts to examine not only the evidence and legal arguments surrounding the trials, but also how the separate convictions and sentences should be treated under Maryland law. Benjamin's trial had produced one of the most important distinctions in the entire case. The jury did not accept the prosecution's case against him in full. On April 9, 2003, he was convicted of second-degree murder involving Crutchley, first-degree assault involving Crutchley, and being an accessory after the fact in connection with the murders. At the same time, the jury acquitted him of murdering Ford and of the related charges involving Ford. That mixed verdict mattered. It demonstrated that the jury was capable of separating the evidence concerning the two victims, rather than simply treating Benjamin as equally responsible for both deaths. His own testimony had attempted to establish such a distinction. Benjamin admitted participating in the division and disposal of the bodies, but denied killing Ford or Crutchley. He claimed that when he returned to the apartment, the two victims were already dead. He said that he then became involved in what happened afterward, and that he was the person who proposed dividing the bodies. The jury did not accept that explanation as a complete defense, particularly regarding Crutchley, but neither did it convict him of Ford's murder. That distinction remained important during the later legal proceedings. One of the issues considered by Maryland's appellate courts concerned the prosecution's presentation of its theory in the separate trials. Because Benjamin and Erica were tried separately, prosecutors had to present evidence against each defendant independently. The defense raised questions about whether the state's theories were consistent and whether evidence used in one proceeding had implications for the other. The appellate courts examined these arguments in the context of the evidence and the charges for which the defendants had been convicted. The Maryland Court of Appeals ultimately upheld the essential convictions against Benjamin. The court's August 27, 2004 decision addressed several legal issues arising from his trial and sentencing. Among those issues was the treatment of the first-degree assault conviction in relation to the second-degree murder conviction involving Crutchley. The appellate court determined that the assault sentence should be merged with the murder sentence. For sentencing purposes, this did not erase the murder conviction. Instead, it affected how the sentences were imposed. The distinction is important because an appellate decision can change the structure of a sentence without overturning the underlying finding of guilt. Benjamin's ultimate sentence was described as 38 years after the relevant sentencing adjustments. The result meant that his conviction remained intact even though the appellate court modified the way certain punishment was applied. The legal process surrounding Benjamin therefore illustrated an important feature of criminal appeals. A defendant can challenge the proceedings successfully on a particular point without obtaining a complete reversal of the conviction. The same broader principle applied to the arguments concerning evidence and prosecution theories. The courts did not have to conclude that every aspect of the prosecution's presentation was perfect. The question was whether the identified errors, if any, were legally sufficient to undermine the convictions. The Maryland Court of Appeals concluded that the essential convictions could stand. Erica's appeal presented a different situation because her convictions were more severe. The jury had found her guilty of first-degree murder for Joshua Ford and second-degree murder for Martha Crutchley. She was also convicted of related theft offenses. Her sentence was life imprisonment for Ford's murder, followed by 20 years for Crutchley's murder. The evidence against her included the .357 Magnum recovered from her possession, the bullets connected to that weapon, the victim's identification documents, Ford's ring, and the biological evidence found inside the apartment. The appellate review, therefore, examined the legal questions raised by her trial while leaving the jury's factual findings intact unless a legal basis required otherwise. The significance of the appeal should not be confused with a new investigation. By this stage, investigators had already reconstructed the major elements of the case through physical evidence and testimony. The appeals were focused on whether the convictions had been reached through legally proper proceedings. The courts were not attempting to discover new victims or new suspects. They were reviewing what had already occurred in the trials. This distinction is especially important in a case where the factual record contains uncertainty. There were questions that could never be answered with absolute precision because the victims were unable to describe their final hours and because their remains were incompletely recovered. The legal system did not require every unanswered factual question to disappear. Instead, the juries evaluated the evidence presented and reached verdicts on the specific charges. The different verdicts for Benjamin and Erica showed the consequences of that process. Benjamin's acquittal on Ford's murder remained part of the official outcome. Erica's conviction for Ford's first-degree murder remained in place. The courts, therefore, did not transform the case into a simple conclusion that both defendants were equally responsible for both deaths. Their legal histories remained different. The physical evidence also retained its importance throughout the appellate proceedings. The .357 Magnum had been recovered from Erica during the Hooters burglary arrest. The bullets found in Ford's remains were linked to that weapon. The bullet found in the apartment contained blood and tissue associated with Ford. The victim's identification documents had been found with Erica, as had Ford's ring, which contained blood from both Ford and Crutchley. The apartment contained blood and DNA evidence associated with the victims. These facts had been presented to the juries and formed part of the evidentiary foundation. Supporting the convictions, the appellate courts did not replace the jury's evaluation of those facts with a completely new interpretation simply because the defense disputed the prosecution's conclusions. Instead, the courts examined whether the legal proceedings met the required standards. Years later, Benjamin pursued another legal challenge in federal court. In 2010, a federal habeas corpus proceeding rejected his challenge and left the criminal result intact. Once again, the significance of the ruling was procedural as well as substantive. Habeas proceedings are not simply another opportunity to retry a defendant from the beginning. They involve specific legal standards governing whether a state conviction violated federal constitutional requirements. The rejection of Benjamin's petition meant that the essential result of the state criminal proceedings remained in place. The appeals therefore closed another chapter in a case that had begun with a missing person investigation. By this point, the sequence was established through the judicial record. Ford and Crutchley disappeared during the Memorial Day weekend of 2002. Their property was found in Erica's possession. The Sifford apartment contained evidence connecting the victims to the location. The .357 Magnum associated with Erica was linked to bullets recovered from Ford, and the defendants were subsequently tried and convicted on different charges. The courts reviewed those convictions and left the central outcome standing. But the legal aftermath also reinforced an important lesson about the case. The truth established in a courtroom does not always provide a complete reconstruction of every moment. The jury can reach a verdict even when some details remain uncertain. In the Sifford case, there was no complete eyewitness account of the killings. There was no surviving victim to explain the sequence of events. The remains were incomplete, particularly in Crutchley's case. The defendants gave different accounts of what happened. Yet the prosecution presented a body of evidence that the juries found sufficient to establish criminal responsibility. For Benjamin, that responsibility was narrower than the prosecution had sought on every count. For Erica, it was broader. Those distinctions survived the appellate process. The case, therefore, ended not with a single uncontested narrative, but with a set of judicial findings. Erica Sifrit remained convicted of first-degree murder for Joshua Ford and second-degree murder for Martha Crutchley, receiving life imprisonment plus 20 years. Benjamin Sifrit remained convicted of second-degree murder involving Crutchley and related offenses, while his acquittal for Ford's murder remained intact. His sentence, after the appellate adjustments, stood at 38 years. The legal system had reached its conclusions, even though some factual questions could never be answered with complete certainty. And beyond the statutes, verdict forms, and appellate opinions, the central human fact remained unchanged. Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley had gone to Ocean City for a holiday weekend. They met people they did not previously know. Within hours, they disappeared. Their belongings remained behind. Their families and colleagues were left searching for answers, and their remains were eventually recovered far from the place where their final hours had unfolded. The appeals could determine whether the convictions were legally sound. They could determine how sentences were calculated. They could reject or uphold particular arguments. But no appellate decision could restore what had been taken from the victims. The final chapter of the case would therefore have to look beyond the courtroom, to the consequences of the murders, the unanswered questions, and the enduring significance of a case that began with an ordinary holiday encounter and ended with 2 people dead and 2 defendants serving lengthy prison sentences. The convictions of Erica and Benjamin Sifrit brought the legal proceedings to an end, but they could not bring an end to the consequences of what had happened during the Memorial Day weekend of 2002. For Joshua Edward Ford and Martha Jenny Crutchley, the story did not end with a verdict, an appellate decision, or a prison sentence. Their lives had been reduced to fragments of evidence, photographs, identification documents, keys, a ring, biological traces, and finally the incomplete remains recovered in Delaware. For their families and those who knew them, the legal conclusion could provide an answer to the question of responsibility, but it could never undo the loss. The case had begun with something almost ordinary. It was a holiday weekend in Ocean City, Maryland. Ford and Crutchley had traveled from Virginia for a short vacation. They met Erica and Benjamin Sifrit through circumstances that, at first, appeared completely unremarkable. The 2 couples encountered one another on a bus heading toward Secrets. Ford and Crutchley helped the Sifrits pay for their bus tickets because the couple did not have enough change, with the understanding that the Sifrits would buy them drinks once they arrived. It was the kind of brief interaction that can happen thousands of times during a busy holiday weekend. Strangers meet, conversation begins, plans change, and people move on. But these 4 people did not simply move on. By the early morning hours of May 26th, Ford and Crutchley had disappeared. The transformation from an ordinary social encounter into a homicide investigation was gradual. There was no immediate understanding of what had happened. Erica's approximately 3 a.m. 911 call initially concerned people she said she did not know being inside her apartment and her inability to find her wallet. No officers were dispatched to the apartment at that time. Days later, the disappearance became unmistakable. On May 28th, a coworker noticed that Crutchley had not returned to work after the Memorial Day holiday and contacted authorities. Police learned that the couple's vehicle remained where they had been staying. Their belongings were still there. There was no obvious indication that they had voluntarily left Ocean City. Those facts transformed the situation into a serious missing person investigation. The breakthrough came from an entirely different crime. On May 31st, police responded to an alarm at a closed Hooters retail store and encountered Erica and Benjamin Sifrit. What initially appeared to be a burglary investigation uncovered weapons and other suspicious items. Benjamin possessed a 9mm handgun and a knife. Erica carried a .357 Magnum and another knife. Inside the Jeep were a .45 caliber handgun, ski masks, plastic restraints, tape, and other items. Then police discovered identification belonging to Ford and Crutchley among Erica's belongings. A burglary investigation had suddenly become connected to two missing people. From that moment, the investigation accelerated. The apartment provided additional evidence. Photographs showed the Siffords together with Ford and Crutchley. Bullets connected to Erica's .357 Magnum were found on a glass table. One contained blood and tissue from Joshua Ford. Keys belonging to the missing couple were discovered. In the bathroom, investigators found blood in multiple locations, and DNA testing connected the blood to Ford or Crutchley. There was a hole in the bathroom area and evidence that the area had been painted. Cleaning products had also been purchased on May 26th. Then there was Ford's ring. The silver dragon ring was found in Erica's possession. An analysis revealed blood from both Ford and Crutchley on it. Each discovery narrowed the distance between the missing couple and the Sifford apartment. Eventually, investigators found the victim's remains in Delaware. The recovery was incomplete. Only Crutchley's left leg was recovered. In Ford's case, investigators recovered the torso and both arms. 2 bullets recovered from Ford's torso were linked to Erica's .357 Magnum. The incomplete recovery meant that some questions would never receive a complete forensic answer. In particular, determining the full cause of Crutchley's death was difficult because so little of her body had been recovered. That limitation is important when considering the case. True crime narratives can sometimes create the impression that every mystery has been solved once a defendant is convicted. This case demonstrates otherwise. A conviction establishes legal responsibility under the applicable standard. It does not necessarily recreate every second of a crime. In the Sifford case, the precise sequence inside the apartment remained dependent on the interpretation of physical evidence, witness testimony, and the defendant's competing accounts. The prosecution argued that the 4 people returned to the Sifford apartment after leaving secrets, that a confrontation developed around Erica's missing wallet, and that Ford and Crutchley were ultimately killed there. Benjamin offered a different account. He admitted helping divide and dispose of the bodies, but denied killing the victims. He said he returned to the apartment and found Ford and Crutchley already dead. The different verdicts against the defendants demonstrate how significant those distinctions became. Benjamin was convicted of second-degree murder in Crutchley's death, as well as related offenses, but he was acquitted of murdering Ford. Erica was convicted of first-degree murder for Ford and second-degree murder for Crutchley. The law therefore assigned them different levels of responsibility. Erica received life imprisonment for Ford's murder plus 20 years for Crutchley's murder. Benjamin's sentence, after the appellate proceedings and sentencing adjustments, was 38 years. The Maryland Court of Appeals reviewed Benjamin's case in 2004 and maintained the essential convictions while addressing the treatment of certain sentences. A later federal habeas corpus proceeding in 2010 also left Benjamin's criminal result intact. These legal developments closed the remaining procedural avenues described in the case record, but they did not eliminate the unanswered factual questions. Perhaps the most enduring question is also the simplest. Exactly what happened during those final hours in the apartment? The available evidence supports the conclusion reached by the courts, but the surviving record does not provide a perfect eyewitness reconstruction. No surviving witness watched the killings from beginning to end. Melissa Selling encountered the Siffords several days later and described Benjamin's threatening behavior and his possession of a firearm, but she did not witness the murders. Benjamin provided his own account, but the jury did not accept it as a complete explanation of his responsibility. Erica's possession of the firearm and the victim's belongings created powerful physical links, but physical evidence could not narrate the entire sequence of events. That uncertainty should not obscure what is known. 2 people who had traveled to Ocean City for a holiday weekend never returned home. Their vehicle and belongings remained behind. Their property was later found in the possession of Erica Sifford. Evidence associated with them was found inside the Sifford apartment. Their blood and DNA were present in the bathroom. Ford's ring was found with Erica and contained blood from both victims. Bullets connected to Erica's firearm were recovered from Ford's remains. Their bodies were divided and discarded, and only incomplete remains were eventually recovered in Delaware. These are not theories. They are the central facts around which the investigation and prosecutions were built. The case is also a reminder of how an investigation can sometimes be solved through an unexpected secondary offense. The police did not initially discover the Sifrits because investigators knew where Ford and Crutchley were. They encountered them during a burglary investigation. The discovery of the victim's identification inside Erica's belongings transformed that unrelated investigation into the breakthrough that authorities needed. From there, the physical evidence led investigators back to the apartment, and the apartment led to the broader reconstruction of the crime. In that sense, the case was solved piece by piece rather than through one dramatic revelation. A wallet complaint, a missing couple, a burglary alarm, a firearm, identification documents, a ring, bullets, blood, DNA, a bathroom, a landfill. Each element became meaningful because it connected to another. But perhaps the most important lesson is not about the cleverness of the investigation or the unusual nature of the evidence. It is about how quickly an ordinary encounter can become irreversible. Ford and Crutchley did not know the people they met on the bus. There was no long history between the two couples described in the case. Their connection began during a holiday weekend and lasted only a short time before violence intervened. The case therefore remains unsettling precisely because of its randomness from the victims' perspective. They were not entering a situation they understood as dangerous. They were simply spending a weekend in Ocean City. Their disappearance then left others to reconstruct their final hours from evidence that could never fully replace their own voices. In the end, the courts established criminal responsibility. Erica Sifrit remained convicted of murdering both victims. Benjamin Sifrit remained convicted of murdering Crutchley and of related offenses, while his acquittal concerning Ford remained intact. The sentences were imposed, the appeals were considered, and the legal process reached its conclusion. Yet the final measure of the case cannot be found only in years of imprisonment or the language of judicial opinions. It is found in the names Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley, in the lives they left behind, and in the fact that a holiday intended to be temporary became their final journey. The Sifrit murders remain a case in which the truth emerged gradually, through evidence scattered across different places and different moments. It began with two people who did not come home. It continued through an unexpected arrest. It was reconstructed through forensic evidence and testimony, and it ended in court with two very different convictions. What remains after all of that is a sober conclusion. The legal system could identify responsibility and impose punishment, but it could not restore the two lives that were lost. The evidence could tell investigators where to look, the courts could determine guilt, and the appeals could determine whether the convictions would stand. None of those processes could return Joshua Ford and Martha Crutchley to the ordinary world they had entered when they traveled to Ocean City. Their story, therefore, ends not with the defendants, but with the victims, two people whose lives were interrupted during a holiday weekend and whose disappearance ultimately exposed a chain of violence that might otherwise have remained hidden.